Hello, and welcome to God in Film, the podcast where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see where we find any parallels with the gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm media coordinator and person you've secretly got a crush on, Giles Goff.
And I'm librarian and compelling female lead, Julia Hall.
And today, continuing with Season 7 of this lockdown project that got out of hand, we'll be looking at It Ends With Us, the controversial adaptation of the book of the same name starring Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. We'll be looking at how to spot domestic abuse, gaslighting, and an Old Testament bad guy who everyone thinks is a good guy. Now, it should be said from the outset, this episode will be covering some really difficult topics like coercive control, and unfortunately, we'll also be looking at sexual violence in the ancient world. And if that sounds like it might be too much for you, please feel free to skip this episode and find one of the lighter, funnier ones in our back catalogue. The Fireman Sam episode is an excellent vintage.
Oh, love that one.
Julia, I made you watch this film for the show,
You did.
and I get the impression you might never forgive me for it.
It was a film that I perceived with my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
As a film, I guess it was fine.
Mm-hmm.
The pacing was fine. The camera work was fine. I just don't understand who this is for.
Yeah. My central criticism of It Ends With Us, and we will get into other criticisms, is that the tone doesn't match the topic.
Not in the slightest.
It's almost as if it's a Mad Libs kind of game of somebody going, hey, let's do a rom-com. Let's make it about domestic abuse. Okay.
You know those things where I fed an AI every script of Batman ever written and asked it to write its own Batman script, and it comes out with the most wildly unhinged nonsense that is Batman, but ultimately also not Batman.
This is going to sound like a terrible comparison, but the closest experience I can have for watching this film was 50 Shades of Grey, right? I don't like it when people are say, oh, this film sounds so terrible, or it sounds so controversial or so bad, I'm not going to see it. Well, if you do that, your opinion's not worth anything then.
Yeah, I will hate watch a film just so that I can talk about it. I sat through the Melissa McCarthy Ghostbusters reboot, not once but twice, just so that I could be justified in absolutely panning it because it is garbage.
Yeah, one of the feelings I had watching the film was thinking, again, this feels like a central protagonist called Lily Bloom, and the characters are called Ryle.
Blossom Bloom and Ryle, who weirdly enough gets riled up easily.
And Atlas, who's carrying the world on his shoulders.
Yeah, and used to say,
I remember
Colleen.
watching it thinking, this must have made sense in the book. This must have all hung together beautifully in a different medium. Is that the case?
Yes and no. I think fundamentally, and reading the book again, like you said, there's a big tone disparity because a good portion of the book is, oh my gosh, Riley is so sexy and he has sexy arms and he's a sexy neurosurgeon. And there are sex scenes in it which are consensual and intended to be, ooh, this is spicy now. But then also, of course, he is violent and abusive. Yeah. But what the book does fundamentally that the film does not is frame the domestic abuse from the get-go. The very first time that Ryle hits her, which in the film is with
the hot
neurosurgeon going, oh no, my food is burning. I'm going to pull out this pot with my bare hand.
Yeah.
I've burnt food before and had to remove it from heat quickly. I have never once not done that without an oven mitt.
I know, right?
In the film, technically it's a casserole dish, potato. But when that occurs in the book, Lily is under no illusions as to what has occurred. Okay. And the book is more about grappling from the get-go. How do I navigate the scenario? This is that I love. This is somebody that I want to be with. But I can't just leave him. As we know, just leaving is not an option most of the time, if not always. Whereas the film,
from what I hear, from what I understand, it takes most women on average about 7 attempts to leave an abusive partner. So
I did not know that is
it,
a horrific statistic.
Yeah, it's not a clean
No.
break.
I mean, in the book, he does sit, and again, a lot of this is glossed over in the film. I mean, he buys her an apartment.
Hmm.
He is fully integrated into her life. They're married.
Yeah.
They have a child together, which does happen in the film. But the film fundamentally runs the storyline as did he really hit her? Did he push her down the stairs? Is he an abuser? Until the last sort of 30 minutes where she goes, yeah, okay, he defo did this, I'm now leaving.
Yeah.
And completely doesn't put together that conflict, which the book does. I mean, the book itself, again, mechanically is readable.
Yeah.
Is it a great work of fiction? No. But
In the film's defense, one of the maxims that I've been told by survivors is that an abusive relationship starts out the same way any other kind of relationship starts
Yes.
out. So you can't tell right from the start.
Yeah.
It's such a incremental difference, I
yes.
think. And I think it got that point across really well. And I think
Yes.
maybe they were reaching, and maybe the reach exceeded their grasp in the sense of they were trying to create Lily as like an unreliable narrator in the film.
Yes. When she says that in the rooftop scene dialogue, I
Oh, yeah.
audibly yelled.
Yeah.
I hated that.
Well,
Absolutely hated that.
it's a little bit like, hey kids, do you like foreshadowing? I know I do. And it just felt, you knew that was going to come back to bite you in the ass later on.
Yeah.
Is it time for us to get into Julia's facts?
I mean, I have some facts. Trying to find just kind of fun, behind the scenes, chill facts about this film was difficult because there are not that many. My favorite one is that when this film came out, it opened number 2 at the box office. The one before it was Deadpool and Wolverine, of course, which stars Blake Lively's husband, Ryan Reynolds, which makes these two the first married couple to star in the top 2 box office films since Demi Moore and Bruce Willis did it with Ghost and Die Hard 2 back in the 90s.
Wow. Blake is in Deadpool and Wolverine, isn't she? She's Lady
Is she
Deadpool.
Lady Pool?
Yeah, Lady Pool.
That's probably my best fact, so I'll lead with that. We'll start
Okay.
on a good foot and just slowly deteriorate. Colleen Hoover has a cameo in this film. She appears during the birthday party scene. I couldn't tell you where precisely, but I'm reliably told by the International Movie Database that she does appear. And the film also had 2 different posters, which again I think really ties in with what we've been talking about earlier. The first draft was a sort of grey tone photo of the 2 leads with the tagline, "We break the pattern or the pattern breaks us." Eventually, I don't know on whose decision, it was replaced with the version that you're probably thinking of, is it that sort of side profile of Lively with sort of I wouldn't say a positive expression on her face, but I wouldn't
Hopeful.
say yes. With the florals again,
Yeah.
we'll get into that. We'll get into the florals with sort of the pink flowers with the tagline, "We love, we break, we can pick up the pieces," which again is interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe not a stylistic choice that I would have made, but I don't make films for a living, so. And speaking of 2 things, the film also had 2 cuts. So Blake Lively pioneered a cut with the same editor that worked on Deadpool and Wolverine, and then Justin Baldoni also had his cut with his editorial team. It's unclear which cut was ultimately used, but apparently the cut that we have witnessed with our eyes was one that was agreed by everybody. So whichever cut that we've seen, whether it's the Lively cut or the Baldoni cut, we perhaps shall never know.
Okay, that's fascinating.
So as I say, yeah, really thin on the ground with facts there, because there, which I can get into if you wish, but obviously there is the multiple lawsuits that are currently flying around.
I'll be honest, I haven't done enough research on that because I just thought, oh, Julia will do it. She'll be fine.
Oh, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's do the guest and then we'll get into that, okay?
Absolutely.
Hey guys, it's Editing Giles here, and we've just dropped our U2 bonus episode on our Patreon page. In it, I hear from a minister and U2 superfan, Reverend Tim Edworthy, who talks us through his 40-year fandom with the greatest Christian rock band that never was. I'm also joined by the host of the RE podcast, Louisa Jane Smith, who loves the band so much she actually did her dissertation on them. Here's a clip.
But I just think that the song itself, is probably has channeled a lot of not his angst, but the tragedy that he's experienced. And only about 3 or 4 years after that, Larry Mullen lost his mum in a car accident. So there's two band members with similar losses. There's probably been anger because of that, but there's also been energy that has sort of transferred itself into their music. And I Will Follow actually comes across as quite a joyful song, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Despite the looking back.
I was just going to say, but it feels as though I Will Follow is subverting the kind of truth, you know what I mean? Because he's saying, I was blind, I could not see. Rather than the Bible saying, I was blind, now I can see.
If you want to hear the full episode, you can go to www.patreon.com/God in Film podcast and sign up to our Bishop Waller Bridge tier. You can also check out our God in Gaming episode. We have longer, extended cuts of interviews and uncut episodes on there where you'll hear it first and in full. So I feel like we're really lucky with this guest that we've got. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Sam Fisher. I'm Chief Exec of Trafford Domestic Abuse Services, which is a charity based in Greater Manchester that supports survivor victims of domestic abuse.
Hi Sam, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It is such a real joy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Giles.
I know this is one of those things where you deal with the complexities of it every day in, day out. Let's start for some absolute basics. How do we define abuse?
Many people still think of domestic abuse as physical violence.
Yeah.
But it is so much more broader than that. Domestic abuse is really about power and control in a relationship, and that can be exerted not just through physical violence, but emotional abuse, financial abuse, psychological abuse. So it's a lot broader than what people tend to label when they hear, domestic abuse, domestic violence. It's why we've shifted away from domestic violence to domestic abuse.
So I find that really interesting because the old-fashioned version is that thing of, well, he doesn't hit me, so it's not really a problem, effectively. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's interesting is we sometimes expect our victims to be absolutely perfect in all things. And I think one of the questions I've got is, what are some of the common misconceptions about domestic abuse and domestic abusers?
So a lot of the common misconceptions is the stereotypical victim, survivor, and the stereotypical perpetrator. So often victims are perceived as a certain gender, a certain class, a certain age, when actually anybody can be a victim of domestic abuse. There is a huge misconception around what that stereotypical victim could look like or should be like. But in terms of abusers and perpetrators, often they are pictured as somebody who is angry or aggressive all the time, when the reality is, abusers are expert manipulators. They can be incredibly charming to the outside world. That's why we often hear things like, oh, but they're always so polite, and oh, they're a great parent, but they wear a mask in public. Them controlling behaviours is what comes out behind closed doors. And going back to the anger, I think another misconception around abuse, rather than whether it be a perpetrator or a victim, is that abuse is always about a loss of control. It's someone kind of, snapping out of anger, when in reality it's very calculated. Again, it's all around that manipulation and that exerting that power and control over somebody. So, what the public or what society may see is not necessarily what's happening behind closed doors at home.
And I think that leads on to our sort of next point, about the sense of deception going on, and deception even when you were there and you experienced it yourself. So one of the words that gets thrown around an awful lot these days is gaslighting. At this point, gaslighting seems, particularly with students, seems to get used whenever you just disagree on anything. So what is gaslighting? What is the definition of it, at least from your side of things?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I don't like using this phrase, but it has seemed to be the buzzword. And we deliver educational workshops in schools, and when I first started doing that 10 years ago, nobody knew what gaslighting was, whereas now, like you say, students are aware and they're saying it all the time, but ultimately, gaslighting is one of the most subtle and confusing forms of emotional abuse. So it's when someone is manipulating you into doubting your own thoughts, your own memories, even your kind of own sense of reality. So, for example, imagine, you're absolutely sure your partner said something hurtful to you last night, but when you bring it up, they say, that never happened. You're just making things up. Oh, why are you exaggerating? I never said that. But over time, that is going to make you start questioning or even trusting your own memory. And that's the definition of gaslighting.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a fairly big red flag. And let's think of this like a public service announcement moment here. So what would you say are some of the early red flags to spot? Because my brain tends to think of it as being like something young people have to worry about, but anybody getting into any kind of new relationship of any age can end up with these sort of things. So what would you say are some of the earliest red flags that you can see that somebody might be an abuser, a perpetrator?
Yeah, I'm really glad that this is, because we really need to be highlighting some of these early red flags. Abuse often starts with small, seemingly innocent behaviours that escalate over time. So an example might be that, your partner might check in constantly saying things like, but I just care about you so much. But then that can turn into tracking your location, demanding to know where you are all the time. So it's all about what can seem like innocent behaviours, but over time can increase to be quite controlling. So other early signs may include like excessive jealousy or possessiveness, that at the start, again, it could be just like, oh, but I just love you so much and I just like being with you all the time. Cutting you off from friends and family, because a key thing what abusers do is isolate you as a person from those that care about you and who support you. Yes, definitely. So that's a big one. Making a lot of decisions for you as well, or blaming you for their emotions. Like, you made me so angry, I had no choice but to shout or to call names. A lot of that blaming, and it's quite easy to brush these off as signs of love or concern. But what I think people have to realise is, as they pile up and as that pattern continues, it is a form of control and it is a form of abuse. And what I always say is around the response to something as well. So, because some of these certain phrases could be innocent, but it's how they would then respond to your reaction. So for example, constantly checking in and you saying, I actually feel uncomfortable about that though. I'm fine. I'll let you know when I land there safe or when I get wherever. And if their reaction is, oh yeah, I know, I get it, sorry, have a great time, then that's fine. But then if their reaction is, well, I care about you, so I'm only trying to, it's often the reaction to the questioning.
Do you know what? I think that's fascinating. It's almost like testing the fence,
Yes.
And I think I've seen in some memes about dating groups where they're advising to women to sort of reject a man's first idea of where to go for a date, just to see how he deals with an idea being put down or being told no, and just see what the reaction is to that.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's really sad that we have to think like that or feel like that, and because relationships are based on trust as well, aren't they? So we need to be confident that we're happy to be in a certain relationship and feel that it's respectful and it's healthy. But it's a bit scary that that's the position where some people think they need to be in, to question from the get-go, really.
Yeah. So assuming you're in a happy, healthy relationship and you are absolutely lucky enough to be in that situation, what happens when you see somebody you care about who does appear to be in an abusive relationship and they can't see it? What's the best way to support them?
Yeah, I mean, this is key, and I think this is what we really need to be educating people on, because it's so heartbreaking to see somebody you care about in an abusive relationship, especially if they're not able to see it or not ready to acknowledge it's happening. So, but the key is to not push them too hard, because we've got to remember, an abuser, all they want to do is isolate that person from their friends and family. And by us pushing too hard, you know, saying, why don't you just leave? That can fuel that isolation. So you might say something like, I noticed you seem stressed lately. Is there anything I can help with? Just remember the door's always open for you if you need to talk. It's all about being non-judgmental and making sure that they know that no matter what, you're there for them. So remind them it's not their fault. Don't ever kind of just say, just leave, because it's really not that simple. You know, that's a whole other podcast, isn't it? Let's face it. Yeah, because, you know, leaving can really put people in danger. So it's, the majority of the time, it's just about being consistent, you know, being a safe space in their life. That's kind of the most powerful thing that you can do. And if they aren't in contact as often, you know, don't automatically assume, well, they're just going to say no to coming out. Still ask them, still keep that communication open so they know when they're ready, or when they become to realise what they're in, then they know they've got that safe space to go to.
Fantastic advice. Thank you so much for that, Sam. Do you want to do a quick plug for TDAS?
Yeah, so TDAS, it's our 35th birthday this year. We're a little local charity based in Trafford that delivers services in Trafford and Salford, actually, and we provide both intervention and prevention services, so accommodation, outreach work, group programmes, and we support adults and children who are experiencing domestic abuse. Anybody that wants to come and follow us on our social media or wants to learn more about volunteering opportunities or how they can support us with fundraising activities. As a charity, you know, we're always trying to raise funds to continue delivering the vital work that we provide, and please do so.
Sam, thank you so much for coming on today. It's depressing subject matter, but it's really lovely to have somebody talk about it so passionately and so articulately. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Giles, for having me. Thank you.
So, Julia, that was Sam. What do you think?
That was so valuable to hear. I think the advice, especially about helping a friend or a loved one who's in an abusive relationship, I wish that perhaps I'd had access to some of that information earlier.
Yeah.
That's really valuable stuff.
Yeah. Essentially, if you're friends with somebody going through domestic abuse, you somehow have to become the most chill person that has ever lived. Because if you call them out on it, if you say, hey, this is really an abusive situation, you need to get out, they'll probably end up rejecting you.
It can backfire very badly, very quickly.
So you then have to just find a way to just hold on for dear life to stay in their life, you know? I thought that was fascinating. I mean, it's like she does this stuff for a living, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's just so crazy.
I am constantly impressed by the standard of guests we managed to get for the show. I'm really
You have really got some crackers this season.
Yeah. I think one of the things I wanted to talk about was gaslighting in the film. One of the things we certainly see is the character of Ryle gaslighting his own wife after he hits her or knocks her down the stairs.
Yeah.
I can't remember if she's in a drugged state, but she's certainly not quite compos mentis, and he's repeating the story back to her from his point of view.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's rewriting her brain chemistry and making her into an unreliable narrator.
Mm.
And the impression I'm getting is that there was an element of art imitating life on this film, wasn't there?
Yeah. Very recently, and this was back in December, you may have seen headlines relating to Blake Lively coming out with a lawsuit against Justin Baldoni, who not only does he direct this film, he stars in it, he produces it, his filmmaking company Wayfarer are behind the making of it. He's got a lot of fingers and a lot of pies in this production.
Yeah.
And that lawsuit was largely a sexual assault complaint, which I won't particularly go into in too much detail, just because I don't particularly want to capitalise on being sensationalist, but I managed to get my hands on the document that was produced by Blake Lively's lawyers. So that's Manor, Phelps and Phillips LLP and the representatives from that firm, and Wilkie Farr and Gallagher LLP and the representatives from that firm. I have learned things that I wish that I hadn't learned.
Okay.
The film production started just before, if you remember, the big SAG-AFTRA strikes.
Yeah.
2023 now.
Yeah. So
initially the production was halted to make room for that, but when it began again in January, Blake Lively insists on a conduct meeting, essentially, to tell, this is against Justin Baldoni and Jamie Heath, who's another high up in Wayfarer, basically to stop sexually assaulting people. And that's
Is
things
assault
like,
the word that's used?
yeah, so there's a myriad of things going on. Some of it is kind of unwanted touching, so, hugs lingering for too long, things like nudity guidelines, and because obviously there is nudity in this, even at the birthing scene, for example, closed sets not being closed sets. Although I believe there are intimacy coordinators present, they weren't always present all the time.
Right, okay.
But even things like not allowing a mother who has recently had a baby to go on a breastfeeding break for 6 hours is what is alleged in this document, or even not letting Blake Lively know that she'd been exposed to COVID, which resulted in both her and her baby contracting COVID. So, stuff like this,
It's not great, is it?
It's not great. It's not a great workplace conduct. And so they have a meeting about this, basically to lay down that none of this is going to continue. We want intimacy coordinators, things like not improvising during sex scenes, not adding any more sex scenes or adding any more shots within sex scenes, stuff that reading it, yeah, I can understand why. I can understand where the previously loopholes may have been found and why perhaps it was felt necessary to shut that down. In response to this, so the press release kind of happens, and then you might remember sort of a few months ago, this kind of very negative press on Blake Lively kind of exploding everywhere.
Yeah, it was one of those things that, it almost kind of happens out the side of your eye. There's old interviews popping up and stuff like that, and I heard that she was accused of things like not having time to talk to people or being busy, or, the phrase difficult on set. Yeah. When you've not got a specific...
There's a reason for this. And I have recently learned a new word, and that new word is called astroturfing.
Okay, I'm here for it.
Reading this document has... If I wasn't a conspiracy theorist before, I am now, and I will tell you why. So astroturfing is the practice of publishing opinions or comments on the internet, in the media, etc., that appear to come from ordinary members of the public, but actually come from a particular company or political group.
Right.
So what Justin Baldoni did is he hired a PR crisis manager. What I've recently learned is the same PR crisis firm/manager that Johnny Depp hired.
Yeah, there's something.
And now I'm rethinking a lot of that. Information that I'm repeating here is from this legal document. So whether you assume that I'm saying allegedly in front of everything or whatever, but this is where the information is coming from. It's not plucked, from nowhere. But I mean, this thing had emails, it had text screenshots, all the receipts. So this PR crisis manager, and this is not small money either, this is like 25k a month kind of money. This is more than I see in a year sort of stuff, and they're using this astroturfing to push certain narratives. Things like, did you ever see sort of articles where it's things like, is Ryan Reynolds sticking his oar in a bit too much? Is, he's come in and why is he at the premiere of this film, and why is he at these meetings, and why is he kind of sticking his oar in It Ends With Us? And it really seems like he's kind of taking Justin's project out from under him. That's astroturfing. That is exactly what Justin's PR team want you to think. Right. And I sound like a conspiracy theorist saying this, right? But it is wild.
There was a quote, I think, talking about Ryan Reynolds, because it came out that Ryan Reynolds had written the
rooftop scene. Yes.
And I think I missed the significance of it, but he wrote it during the...
Yeah, it's alleged that he broke picket lines to do that. My research has largely been looking at this lawsuit. I haven't seen anything that would say either way on that. But I'm slowly coming to not really trust anything that I read on the internet. Yeah, things like, and this is stuff from text messages from these PR representatives, quote, confidentially, I'm out to dinner with a friend of 12 plus years who writes for People magazine, Fox News, In Touch, Us Weekly, and she is fully briefed of the situation and is armed and ready to take the story of Blake weaponizing feminism to any of her outlets the minute we give her the green light. She hates Blake, has heard the story before, and will do anything for us. That's a direct text message. Things like, I've already off the record spoke to the editor of Daily Mail because she's my friend. And one that really turned my stomach from this PR representative was, quote, all press is so overwhelming. We've confused people. So much mismessaging. It's actually really funny if you think about it. That's verbatim. I just want to stress I have not embellished. That is absolutely verbatim.
Yeah.
Things like using Baldoni's ADHD diagnosis as a smokescreen to kind of explain any awkward behaviour.
Yeah, that's coming out because apparently
Yes.
if you're autistic, then you can definitely get away with Nazi salutes
You can
now.
get away with anything now. But a
Yeah.
text from Justin Baldoni, which is in this legal document, this is specifically from his keyboard. With everything going on, I want to have an offensive move showing my neurodivergence and some of the attributes that come with it so I can start talking about it.
Okay.
I know, right? And I'm sat there now, like, how much astroturfing have I unwittingly consumed? Because initially my research was looking at things like, okay, I'm looking at things like The Guardian, I'm looking at Elle magazine, I'm looking at Glamour magazine, which, you know, especially these sort of what I call kind of glossy magazines.
Yeah.
You don't expect them to be, you know, the absolute peak of you know, classy journalism or whatever, but you expect them to be grounded in fact.
What it is, it's the kind of tactics we're used to in political journalism
Yes.
being applied to the entertainment industry, like smear campaigns and all this sort of thing, you know? It reminds me of like old Hollywood, you know, the studio system where studio execs would like plant stories with like client journalists and this sort of thing.
And blacklisting and all that kind of stuff. Because I dimly remember sort of in the chit chat in between takes when we were recording last, sort of mentioning, oh, I feel like the promotion's really off of this film. Like Blake Lively isn't really talking about it, but Justin Baldoni seems to be really talking about, you know, the domestic abuse aspect. Yes, because that's what his PR team have told him to do. Quote from him, I'd like you guys to start posting me only talking about domestic violence and clips and why this movie is so important. It's harrowing to read for me because I'm now questioning everything. And I, as a rational person, we understand social media isn't real. And we understand that there's an element of editing and filtering in everything that we see online. But this just feels like a whole new level to me, and it is sinister, and I don't like it. Horrendous. New York Times got wind of this, and they wrote an article called "We Can Bury Anyone Inside a Hollywood Smear Campaign," which Baldoni, I believe, has responded to with a lawsuit, to which the New York Times went, it's called journalism, babes. But the thing is also is that particular New York Times article is paywalled. So I wasn't able to read it.
Yeah.
So again, things that are, and again, maybe my tinfoil hat is well and truly on, but things that are perhaps more balanced, perhaps require a deeper level of research, are hard to access. I mean, this legal document was 80 pages. I had a lot of spare time on my hands at work. You know, it's not things that the normal average public consumer is going to go looking for. If they're being made to pay for a one-off article they kind of had half an interest in reading, they're not going to read it. So a lot of this information is flying completely under the radar, which is only exacerbated when on the 22nd of January, so as of the day we are recording this 2 days ago, Baldoni releases some behind-the-scenes footage of a take, which in the film, it's about 30 seconds worth of the film. It's that sort of montage where they're falling in love and they're at a bar and they're kind of slow dancing. And I won't go too deep into it because I've been yapping for a while, but basically what appears to happen in the take doesn't directly correlate to what she accuses him of, which is dragging his lips from her ear down to her neck and saying it smells so good. Creepy behaviour. But obviously they're filming a love scene. There is a lot of area that can be manipulated to brush off certain behaviour.
Yeah.
It's a very grey area place to be. And the actual footage itself doesn't show that explicitly. There's a portion where he's kind of nuzzling at her neck and he says, "Oh, am I getting beard on you today?" And she replies, "Oh, I'm getting spray tan on you." And he says, "Oh, it smells good." Which again, okay, isn't exactly what has been alleged in the document, but multiple times in this clip, he's going in for kisses. She's sort of saying, "Oh, I think actually our character should be talking. I think it just is more romantic that way." At least in my eyes, there seems to be a clear trying to divert away from
there's a
certain
disconnect
behaviour.
going on here.
And yet every single comment under this video was negative or in favour of the sort of Baldoni side of things. And I'm sat there going, who wrote that? His PR team? A random member of the public? I'll never know.
See, here's the thing that I find really weird. I find the idea of directing yourself quite stressful.
Yeah, how would you do that?
I could do it for short stuff and short periods of time, but I'm always like a supporting character in my own films. I'll fit in a cameo or whatever. And you have to trust your DP, trust your assistant directors and all that sort of stuff. But especially with subject matter like this, where you are somebody's boss and their scene partner.
Yeah.
You have to be... First of all, it doesn't sound like a great idea to do in the first place, Secondly, if you were going to do that, it's like he's not put in the checks and balances.
Yeah, it's things like you have to be so extra careful. I mean, even as and you would get this, working in a school. Even things that would seemingly be innocuous, we have to be super vigilant of.
Yeah.
Things like open door policies, a quick, "Oh, can I just talk to you one-on-one for a second because I need to discuss your grade with you," or something.
Yeah.
9.5 times out of 10, perfectly normal. But that 0.5 times out of 10 where a one-on-one is not an okay situation, we as teachers and school staff, we take precautions.
Do you know what? There was one time where I'd got two boys. I said, "Can you boys stay behind, please?" And the door is open, and I'm talking to one student about his behaviour. Had a reasonably good interaction with him. Let him go, and then I said to the other kid, "Okay, yeah, Timmy, you can go. I just needed a witness just to be in the room."
Yeah,
it's followed me into my post teaching life. We had an intern start. She was like 22, and she was working on the media with me. And my studio is separate to the main office at church. And I said to one of my friends who works in the room, "Can you just nip it? Can you find an excuse to pop in?" Every so often, and the door's open. Like I say, this is an adult woman that I'm dealing with, but you're conscious of the power differentials, and you want to make it so that the other person is going to feel supremely comfortable with you at all times. And it's so weird because, like I say, Justin Baldoni, he's a few months younger than me. He's obviously interested in the topics of domestic abuse and coercive control and all the rest of it. So how does he end up with such a big fat blind spot when it comes to his own behaviour?
And I'm reading these things. It's things that, again, I think have largely been normalised and sort of, locker room talk and this, that and the other. But especially if you're going to do sex scenes where one or both of you is going to be partially nude, my guy, even if it's just to protect your own back, so God forbid, should someone turn around and go, "Well, actually," and you've not done anything wrong, which I don't believe is the case here, you're going to put that safeguarding in place, and you're going to protect, even if it's just to protect your own back. At the end of the day, you are still going to do that. A lot of this is stuff that could have easily been avoided if it had wanted to be avoided.
Yeah.
From the evidence that I have accrued and kind of seen, there's one account of, I believe it wasn't him, but Jamie Heath, who is he's another high up member in Wayfarer, which is the film studio, for the scene where Lily's giving birth, basically shoved under her nose a video of his wife giving birth, and she was like, my guy, what are you doing? I feel like if I was in that position, because in the document, apparently Blake kind of turned around and went, does your wife know that you're doing that, by the way? To which his response is, oh, like, she wouldn't mind. Just going, hey, we're about to shoot a birth scene. Would you like to see this footage? And when the answer is probably going to be no, you go, okay, cool, and you don't show it because I wouldn't want to see that.
Blake Lively has had 2 or 3 kids at this point, so I don't think she needs to know.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and things like I think initially the actor that was going to play the doctor at the scene just apparently kind of brought in and went, oh yeah, it's a mate of mine. It wasn't somebody that was kind of auditioned or put through the process. That was something that kind of came up in the January meeting of people that are going to be on set around people naked need to be, hired properly and not, oh, this is my mate. Yeah. Can he be at close quarters with your lower quarters? No.
That's what seems to be happening here. He seems to be acting like he's making a film with his mates when it's the workplace. It's a workplace environment.
A film is still a workplace, even if you are A-listers. And again, I think when you're the director and the star and the man in charge and kind of you've got all that going on, it sounds like he doesn't really think about what it means from a HR perspective, what it actually means. Don't cherry pick the quote unquote fun parts. Where you get to do all the good stuff and then just completely ignore basic safety regulations. This could have been avoided if you just made really basic safeguarding things in place. Do you know what I mean? One thing that crops up a lot is Blake Lively feeling that she was fat shamed when he basically turned around and sort of said, well, how much are you going to weigh? Because I'm going to have to pick you up. Which he's spinning as, oh, but I have a lower back injury and I needed to know. A grown woman is going to weigh about as much as a grown woman. Do you know what I mean? You can probably look at that and go, okay, if I have a crippling lower back injury, I'm probably going to know how much. Does she weigh more than a bag of flour? Yeah, probably. Okay, then we won't do it. Do you know what I mean?
If you've got a back injury, mate, then this is what the stunt doubles are for,
Yeah. Do you know what? Yes, I hadn't even considered that as a thought.
We should probably talk about some Bible stuff now, thinking about it.
Yeah, we probably should.
Now it's time for Finding the Faith in the Film.
Ba-ba!
I feel like what's happened is we've got gaslighting in the story. It certainly sounds like we've got gaslighting on the film set. We've got gaslighting on the internet because we're trying to be told to believe something that's
perfectly unwitting members of the public are kind of running with this, and especially if people are essentially going back and find it. And I have seen some of these interviews. Some of them are not Blake Lively's best moments, but at the end of the day, they're separate things. Just because somebody was rude in an interview 10 years ago does not mean that they are either one, making up a sexual assault, or two, I feel, and this might be me adding 2 and 2 and getting 25, but there seems to be this kind of underlying of she kind of deserves it anyway because she's a mean girl.
Victims don't have to be nice people.
Yes, they don't have to be perfect.
Have to be perfect. We saw this sort of thing with the whole Amber Heard, Johnny Depp thing all over. Anyway, the point I was trying to get at was there's also gaslighting in the Bible. Now, let's be clear about our terminology. Sam defined it really well. It comes from an old film called Gaslight, where you try to basically tell somebody that the way they experienced things that have happened to them firsthand isn't what happened. And I feel like there's an element of that going on with a particular character in the Old Testament. So if I said King David, what do you think of? What are the top lines?
Is this the same David and Goliath David? Or is this okay, so that one's all about being the little man and overcoming big, powerful, scary people. Yeah,
Yeah, okay. So I'm going
so
to
profound.
I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version and say, so David is, I think he's like the youngest son of a guy called Jesse. He's a shepherd boy. So we've talked about shepherds being really lowest man on the totem pole in the past, and he defeats Goliath. And the king at the time is a guy called Saul.
Oh, I remember this guy.
Now, let's be clear.
This is a different guy.
Different Saul.
Saul.
So, Old Testament Saul, way back in the past. Saul, who becomes Paul, is like just after the Gospels. Yeah, New Testament.
Okay.
To give even more backstory, Israel really wanted a king.
Mm-hmm.
And God was like, I don't think you do want a king. I think that's probably not a great idea. You know, prior to this point, they'd been ruled by what were called the judges, who they were these sort of leaders who, more like a chieftain, you know, they kind of lead for their life, and then it's not hereditary, it gets passed on to somebody else, you know. But anyway, this is one of those things where God kind of gives in and said, okay, you can have a king, and it's Saul. And Saul, again, starts off very humble, becomes more and more unstable because of David.
Yeah.
When David defeats Goliath, David goes on to be like this kick-ass musician. You know, I heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. That kind of vibe, you know?
Yeah.
And everybody flipping loves David, and Saul can't handle it. There's one point where basically Saul throws a spear at David's head and he just ducks it and it just goes straight to the wall, this sort of thing. He has to go on the run, and then Saul decides he's going to kill him. Weirdly, at this point, everybody else in Saul's family thinks David's great. Jonathan, his son, is David's best friend. David ends up marrying one of Saul's daughters, and Saul ends up dying and not in the best.
I can kind of see why he'd be mad, though. There is nothing more annoying than that one person that you hate that everyone else is like, oh, he's such a great guy. Yeah, no.
Don't even get me started. Anyway,
justice for Saul.
Short version, David ends up becoming king and is really successful in battle, and it's quite a prosperous time. Okay? Now, there's one thing I'm going to drill down to, and I think you probably might have heard about it somewhere in the ether, and it's David and Bathsheba. Is that ringing any bells?
Yes.
Okay.
And what I do notice is that Bathsheba, I feel like, tends to be a name now with very negative connotations. Like,
yeah, which is quite
the witch in The Conjuring is called Bathsheba.
Ah, that's fascinating.
So
right,
I feel like I might get context for that in a minute.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
If it's any help, it's a totally unearned.
Yeah, I figured that might be the
I don't think
case.
she leaves it. Let me read to you 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 2, and I'm going to read on from there, okay? So one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. I know that sounds weird, but kings at this time, their roofs, they would probably turn into a garden. So what it means is he walks around his little roof garden. Okay?
Yeah, that's cute. We love that for him, you know.
From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Great, thanks for that. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I'm pregnant." So David is in a really uncomfortable position now because he has several wives at this point. I'd have to check, but at this point he has something like 6 wives. Okay? But now he has slept with another woman, another man's wife, she's come back pregnant, and Uriah the Hittite obviously means he's a different nationality to the...
Yeah.
So he's like a mercenary general. He fights for the Israelites, but he's not one himself. And the problem is he's gotten her pregnant while her husband is away at war, so there is no plausible deniability to be had here, right?
Yeah.
And what happens is David's like, okay, I've got it. Brilliant. I will get Uriah back in. We'll have a big feast. We'll get him drunk, send him home to his wife. He'll sleep with his wife, and then, boom, that's me covered. Sorted, okay? Turns out Uriah is this super honourable dude. If you are sort of back from waging war with your army and you're back on home turf, you don't go back to your house until like the war is over, right? So
Right, yeah.
he gets him to this feast, he gets him super drunk, and then Uriah's like, great, okay, thanks guys, have a good one, and then goes back to his men at the end of the night. So there goes our plausible deniability, right? What David does next is David orders Uriah and his regiment to be sent to the worst, harshest part of the battle and withdraw his support. So
Okay, I'll try and stick with it. Okay.
okay. So what happens is Uriah ends up dying in battle in something that was tactically preventable. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's done on the orders of David. I'm going to skip ahead to 2 Samuel 11:26. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Sketchy as hell, right?
Yeah, and I feel like the initial description of, oh, he saw some naked lady and he was like, who's that? And she was like, oh, it's me. And we're just gonna spend the night together. And I'm sure that was definitely all
It was totally
above
consensual,
board.
wasn't it?
Yeah, because I feel like that's not the only sort of story like that in the Bible.
No,
I
no,
feel like
ma'am.
there's a couple of instances where it happens.
Yeah, I wish.
Then sending a husband to go die so
Yeah.
that you can just marry her.
Yeah.
My brother in Christ, maybe just don't fool around with married ladies. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
I
Like,
wish I could tell you that was the end of it.
oh my
Okay.
God. Okay.
So, do you know how when Trump got inaugurated, there was that vicar, that reverend, I can't remember.
Yes, we love her.
Reverend Bud.
Yes.
Something like that, who basically speaks truth to power like nobody's business, right? There's a guy like that called Nathan, who is a prophet, and he comes and he speaks to David. I'll read out a bit to you what you got. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveller came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare the meal for the traveller who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. I think you can probably guess where this is going. Verse 7, then Nathan said to David, you are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed yoking over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all of Israel and Judah, and if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own.
That's such a raw line. Was it now the sword shall never...
The sword will never depart from your house.
That was such a raw line.
Yeah, we will get to that sword never departing his house in a little bit, okay? Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. I've skipped out a little bit. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die.
It was a bit unfair.
That's accurate. That is accurate. Now, this is one of those things, right? One of 2 things is true at this point. Either God is radically different in the Old Testament to who he is in the New Testament, he has an absolute personality change, or God is, what's the phrase? God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And maybe some of what's going on here is being filtered through the speakers who are looking at what's happened and ascribing God's judgment to things.
Yeah, I think we discussed this before, that
Yeah.
certain translations of the Bible have their own biases, potentially.
Yeah. My view on that is, I think maybe a child died, and maybe that's a terrible thing, but I don't believe that God, sorry, I want to say maybe that's a terrible thing. That is definitely a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Personally, I would struggle to believe that's God doing that. I think what's more likely is the writers ascribing tragedy to God's hands. But that is a longer conversation for another time. And maybe that's me trying to let God off the hook. But it doesn't sound like the God I know. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. There tends to be this unspoken agreement that the Old Testament is like, not legit is the wrong word, but like the Old Testament, there's something sus about the Old Testament in the way that God behaves entirely differently he's a lot more wrathful. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a lot more kind of fire and brimstone in the Old Testament stuff. That seems to be a general theme.
Anyway, let me skim forward a little bit. After Nathan had gone home, verse 15, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. Standard grieving procedure. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed that his attendants were whispering themselves, and he realized the child was scared. And then, verse 20, then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went into his own house, and at his request they served him food and ate. His attendants asked him, why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But now that child is dead, you get up and eat. He answered, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept, and I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. Now, I am not an Old Testament scholar, but that line, who knows, that the Lord may be gracious and let the child live. Wait, so you were doing all that weeping and crying and sackcloth and ashes stuff in the hope that God would change his mind, and now that he hasn't, you're just like, eh.
Yeah, like the sentiment of, being sad isn't going to bring this person back. I could be like, yeah, that makes sense. Maybe like a week or a month later, when you've, and there's no timer on grief. It's almost a sentiment that I can get behind. But the day after, clearly you didn't care that much.
It just seems odd that, it's such an odd line to put in there. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. Now, I hope somebody can tell me how wrong I am here, but it sounds quite transactional. I thought if God could see how sad I was and how sorry I was, he might spare my son's life, but now oh well, never mind.
I can see how someone would maybe give him the benefit of the doubt in that, it was kind of a genuine, if I show how genuinely upset I am, then pity will be taken upon me. But
I get it.
Then when the day after, you're like, oh yeah, okay, doesn't matter now, I guess. Lol.
I get it. Grief isn't linear. Sometimes there have been times, particularly with a long illness, where I have grieved more for the person who's dying while they were still alive than after they died. And it's because you've got a lot of those bad feelings out your system, and when it actually happens, it's almost a relief because they're not in pain any longer, So, benefit of the doubt, he's feeling them out, at those feelings out of usual order, but it's a weird one, right?
Yeah.
Now, we talked about the sword will never depart your house, And he
Such a long
has estimates put it between 6. Bathsheba makes 7. I don't think he goes as high as 18 wives, which is apparently like the cutoff point. That's when it's getting ridiculous,
18 what?
But he does have concubines as well. So
he got the loophole wives. Okay.
Yeah. So when it talks about the sword will never depart his house, basically his children are the worst in essence. One of his sons rapes his half sister. Another one of his sons kills the rapist, and there's one called Absalom who, I can't believe I'm saying this, but there's this belief somewhere along the line that if you sleep with a king's wife or a king's concubine, it kind of makes you the next king. So a tent is put up on a roof and Absalom sleeps with all of David's concubines, and it's gross. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like,
yeah.
I don't want to really stick the knife in too much with the bad parenting, but these lads learned this behavior from somewhere. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if they learned that you can take whoever you want, you get to, even when it's exposed, it's not you paying the price, it's a baby paying the price for your sins. And that you won't feel anything directly, they might be learning all the wrong lessons. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and there's something so whack about, if you sleep with a king's wife, like, you'll be the next king. I don't even know how to describe this, but almost ascribing a level of power to those women, but then also none at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, it's such a paradox in that clearly there's something so high about them.
There's something
that
messed
mere
up there.
action. Yeah, it's something so weirdly paradoxical in that the misogyny is so rife.
I think we can all agree this is not a family you want living next door, is it? So anyway, there is more than I can cover in this episode, but I was like, okay, well, surely David's learned his lesson, right?
Yeah. He's going to disown some of these wacko sons and be like, nah.
1 Kings chapter 1. So this is the next, if you imagine like 1 Samuel is like the story of like young David and sort of young King David, and 2 Samuel is like sort of David as a king and all the rest of it, and where the corruptions, where he really starts to sort of his fall from grace. Then 1 Kings is where we start to get into his descendants, right?
Yeah.
But it starts with King David, 1 Kings, right? So when King David was very old, he could not keep warm even when they put covers over him. So his attendant said to him, "Let us look for a young virgin to serve the king and take care of him. She can lie beside him so that our lord the king may keep warm."
That's so interesting to me because there's a story in the Mabinogion where it's like Math can only like survive if he like rests his feet on the lap of a virgin.
Yeah.
Virginity ascribed to such high powers, but then only for the furtherment of men. It's paradoxical. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So she's effectively like this hot water bottle. I
need to get me one of those, man.
Some of the racier
descriptions
describe it almost like a hot water bottle.
Wow.
So check it out. Verse 3. Then they searched through Israel for a beautiful young woman and found Abishag, very unfortunate name, a Shunammite, and brought her to the king. The woman was very beautiful. She took care of the king and waited on him, but the king had no sexual relations with her. So there's
that's so brave of him.
I think there's
so
some suggestion that it's more about like impotence at this point.
Good.
Kind of exegesis at this point suggests that. And some of my friends, we were talking about this, some of my friends suggested that it wasn't a sexual relationship. And I'm not being funny, but you don't have to have intercourse with somebody for it to be a sexual relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not, this is totally fine and totally normal and not weird at all, and we're definitely not crossing, no, we had sex, now it's definitely crossed the line. Because if it wasn't a sexual relationship, why does it have to be a beautiful young woman? Why does she have to be a young virgin? Look, if he's feeling cold, I'll give him a cuddle to warm him up. I'm great at giving hugs. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's this emphasis is placed on sexual characteristics, but also for their lack of sex.
And he still has his wives at this point, right?
Do they not count? Are they not warm enough?
Bathsheba, the woman who he sort of stole off Uriah the Hittite, is still alive. She's still a character that plays a part in this part of the story, you know? So it feels to me, not that David didn't learn his lesson, but David learned the wrong lesson.
Yeah.
Instead of, maybe I should learn to keep it in my pants, what David learned was, I should probably not steal another man's wife because that's going to be hard work, you know? Because check this out. She's young, she's a virgin, or possibly a virgin. That's not super clear. She's a Shunammite, so that means she is a foreigner living in Israel. She is not an Israelite, so that means she's not necessarily going to have the same rights. Not all the same laws are going to apply to her. And I don't. It says that she took care of the king and waited on him, but again, was
he paying her wages?
You work with teenagers, right? If you said to a 16-year-old girl, I need you to get into bed with that 70-year-old man to keep him warm,
I would lose my job immediately.
Exactly.
And then I would probably be struck off and I would never work in education again.
Yeah. And the thing that throws us, the thing that doesn't make any sense, is that God still loved him. Okay? So I've got good news and I've got bad news for you tonight, Julia. Okay?
Okay.
So the good news is that it doesn't matter what you do. There is nothing you could do that would make God love you any less. You are his child. He thinks you're great. He tells all his mates about you. He's very impressed with the D&D campaigns you've been running.
Oh my God, thank you.
He is your biggest fan. Okay, that's the good news, all right? The bad news is God loves all the people you hate as well. You know, God loves all of them. They don't deserve it. We don't deserve it either, but in our heads we're kind of thinking, yeah, I kind of do, because I'm a pretty good person, so I reckon I kind of think I do deserve it, but, you know. So David's story, which takes up quite a significant chunk of the Bible, of the Old Testament, I should say, is that God doesn't turn his back on you ever. Okay? God keeps his promises even if you do not. Okay? That's a great message to have. David certainly starts off brilliant. He is the word that keeps coming up is he was a man after God's own heart. That's 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 14. But now your kingdom will endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. So that's a reference to David and this sort of thing. And people love him. Christians really love David. In fact, Jesus is descended from the house of David.
From David's line,
from David's line. So he is a big deal, even though he is demonstrably a creep.
Did he do anything? Did he build a really nice aqueduct? Or, was the city, prosperous? And is that kind of why
this is the thing,
people are kind of happy to overlook this?
A lot of times he picks out the spot that will become the site that his son Solomon will build the temple on, and I think that is the temple that's going to endure until somebody burns it down. These things are always getting burnt down, you know? Yeah. So the reason why this is bad for Christians is that when we're sort of taught in a sermon or taught Bible stories, you get excerpts. You know, we say we're going to look at this passage today, not we're going to start in 1 Samuel. We're going to go through 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. We're going to finish in Kings. It doesn't happen that often, you know? Yeah. And obviously, when we've got the kids' Bible version of things, you're going to skip over the bad bits, you know? David's story, David and Goliath, is a brilliant story that if you have faith in God, it doesn't matter what you've got and it doesn't matter how big the opposition is. God will see you through. That's always brilliant. That's a fantastic story to hold back to. What happens, though, is there starts to become this minimalization of David's
transgressions,
sins. I mean, The only phrase I could think of was when he acts out sexually, which was the phrase that sort of came to mind. And because how can I put it? Sometimes you need to get some info from people, and writing something in a slightly racy way will get a bit more of an attention. So
Yes.
I wrote on Facebook, my dudes, I'm working on something for the podcast, and I'm hoping you could square a particular circle for me. King David in the Old Testament is, if I were being generous, a man who made mistakes. And if I were being pragmatic, a man who makes Harvey Weinstein look like lame by comparison. Anyone got a good reason why this guy's held in such high esteem in Christian circles? How many comments do you think that has underneath it?
So I remember seeing this one. I think it had about 4,
Yeah.
and I skim read some of this,
it
and
has
I was
grown.
like, some feathers are definitely getting ruffled.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna let that sit.
34 comments in there. Okay, some of them are me, obviously, responding to people and not backing down on stuff, and some of them are there's almost a confusion. But he was a man after God's own heart. It's and what I saw happening, and what does happen, is they'll say, well, I think it's good that we're seeing a story of somebody who wasn't perfect. If God only dealt with perfect people, he'd have no space for us. And it's like, yes, that's true. That is demonstrably true. I don't know if not perfect would be the words I would use.
Yeah, for me, not perfect is like, oh, I don't always separate my recycling, or it's forgivable things.
It's minimizing the horrendous things that are happening. If we brought it into a modern time, if I said, well, of course, Julia, Michael Jackson wasn't perfect, but he made some amazing songs. You're like,
Yeah, we're seeing that quite a lot at the moment. The Neil Gaiman discourse at the moment.
We can pick it out when it's in modern times. We can pick it out easily. But Christians are kind of hamstrung because there is such a focus on forgiveness. We can be bad at calling out abuse, and this has happened in the case of with things like sort of Catholic church abuse or Protestant church abuse. Yeah. There was a guy called Mike Pilavachi who was a major figure in Soul Survivor, which was like a wonderful thing for like young Christians to go to, and he was absolutely loved. He came across as so humble and so sort of loving. I think Claire even heard him speak at some point, and he had been developing inappropriate relationships with interns and getting the young men who were part of these interns, who these intern programs, to come to his house where they would wrestle, or he would give them a massage and all this sort of stuff, you know? Yeah. And the female interns, he would sometimes be completely cold towards them, and they wouldn't know why. And it took years for this abuse to come to light.
Yeah.
And it rocks about. And part of the reason why people don't want to question it is he was getting results, you know? When he would preach, kids would come to Christ. And hallelujah, as far as I'm concerned, that's a brilliant thing to happen. But as in the secular world, people don't want to argue with success.
Yes.
And in the ancient world, King David is this powerful king. He's winning battles and he's forging alliances and all this sort of stuff. So people are letting stuff slide. Whereas if he was just a creepy dude who lived in a caravan park, we'd be like, I don't know if this is as cool as you think it is, you know?
You know that meme where it's like a lady in the office and the top panel is like a conventionally handsome guy who kind of leans around the office cubicle and is, hey, you free for dinner tonight? And she's like, oh yeah, maybe. And the bottom panel is the same scenario, but it's like an unconventionally a guy who's not attractive, who's overweight and with glasses, and instead she's reaching for the phone and kind of calling HR.
Yeah,
it's I feel the epitome of that meme.
Yeah,
people do not want to, and we're seeing now in a modern setting, it's hard to call out people in positions of power, even if that's just they were a director on a film. You know, you're not going to call the king out for being a perv, especially if he's been handpicked by God.
Yeah. And this is
So-
it. The spiritual and the political at this point are the same thing. If a man has been appointed by God to be king, what are you going to say to that? Do you know what I mean? It's basic sort of power and control sort of thing. One of the lines that keep coming back to me is people would say, well, it was a different time. It was a different context. You have to appreciate it in the context of things. And my answer is, okay, did women not have feelings back then? If we work on the assumption that women are human beings and they've always been so, it's not just happened, it's not something that's just happened in the last few years. They've always been, how can I put it, traded like cattle, you know?
Yeah,
like
they have very little agency of their own.
These concubines that we're talking about with Absalom and the rest of it, they're not like, oh gosh, I really hope I get picked by the king. They don't have a lot of choice in this matter. And God loved them as much as he loved David. God spent as much time thinking about them and creating them. They are daughters of the one true living God, and they're being treated like things. And it's not okay. And it wasn't okay then, and it's not okay now. And the problem is that when we say things like, oh, he wasn't perfect, we have to consider time, the non-Christians are hearing us. They're hearing what we're saying, and we're starting to lose all credibility with them. Yeah. So what does a person do with this information? And where I'm trying to come to is, you can acknowledge with David that God loves him, and there were times he did some amazing things for God. But my friend John Stammers had this wonderful line. He said, there are no heroes in the Old Testament except God. All the people in the Old Testament who do great or good things will a few verses or pages later be also doing questionable and terrible things. And it shows you how none of these guys, none of them match up to Jesus. None of them match up to the Messiah, you know? Because Jesus is a dude who is good for all times. Do you know what I mean? When the worst thing you can say about him is that he sort of will flip tables I was
going to say flip tables,
I thought you'd
man.
like that, you know?
I love that. That's probably my favourite Bible story.
Yeah.
I just love the idea of hench Jesus, because I will always stand by the theory that he was hench. Mans was a carpenter. He would have the biceps on Jesus. You know what I mean?
You and hench Jesus go back a bit.
That's a hark back to the earlier episodes, still, listeners. So if you want to,
whatever works for your Julian headcanon, that's good for
I got my own theories.
So I think I'm going to wrap this up by saying that God loves David in the same way he loves us, and he'll stick by us even when we don't stick by him. And that's a good lesson to have about David, but we don't need to hero worship David. We can treat him just like any other Old Testament character. And I think this is really important for our own credibility. We need to recognize that what he did was wrong then and it was wrong now, and not to minimize his faults, not hide behind lines like not perfect, because sometimes people do good things and sometimes people do bad things as well, and it makes it really complicated and difficult and chewy, and it's hard to love them.
Can I just share a line from the book? Actually, it ends with us from my Bible this session, which I don't know, feels like it may be relevant. And it's something, I think it's something that Ryle says, so I'm taking it with a grain of salt. There's no such thing as bad people. We're all just people who sometimes do bad things. Which, again, feels like somebody trying to be profound and deep. I read it and immediately had to write it down under the heading WTF. But yeah, you know what I mean? Maybe badness isn't inherent, but people can still do terrible things.
Yeah. And
for whatever reason.
Pretending that they didn't doesn't help our cause. You know,
no,
doesn't make us look good. Doesn't means we're not allowed to sit with the cool kids when we do that. Okay, we are going to wrap that up there because I feel like we have dealt with some very heavy subject matter in the lightest, funniest way that we possibly could.
Perfectly in keeping, I feel, with the film.
Film. Yeah. Wonderful. Julia, have you had a good time?
I feel like we've been able to get our teeth into this episode. So yes, I suppose I did.
Awesome. I have so much fun talking to you. Okay, listeners, thank you very much. If you have been, thanks for listening. Our next episode is going to be Captain America Civil War. Julia, are you looking forward to that one?
I cannot wait. You know I love Cap with every atom of my being.
Okay. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye. God in Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff.
That's me.
Mixing and editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by
Julie Walsh.
And our theme tune was composed by
Rick Lee.
Waffle editing by
Natalie Miniker.
Please rate and review.
Please give us 5 stars because that's a nice thing to do.